Thank you very much for joining us today. We have a great conversation with some world-renowned sound designers and a couple of experts here at L-Acoustics as well. I want to introduce our panel for today and let you know who we've got joining us. So, Fred Vogler, thank you for joining us. Fred, you're coming to us from the Pacific Palisades, is that correct?
That's correct. Welcome. Nice to be here.
And Fred, you're a sound designer extraordinaire working with the LA Philharmonic, the Hollywood Bowl, among other things. You've scored, helped mix and produce for movies as well. Thank you for joining us. I really appreciate you taking the time. The office looks quite nice there. Looks like a lovely sunny Southern California day. Next up, Scott Willsallen. Scott, you're coming to us from London. Is this your flat in London, correct?
Hey, everyone. It is, yeah. Yeah, a dreary London day yet again.
And Scott, you don't sound like you're a native of London. It sounds like you might be from a slightly different part of the world, if I'm correct.
I don't know what you're talking about.
Okay, got it. Excellent. So you're not a convict. So we're just going to check on that.
Yeah, from originally from Sydney, moved over here because I spent too much time on airplanes. Now I'm spending less time on airplanes, but then aren't we all?
Excellent. Guillaume Lenost, director of L-ISA. Thank you for joining us today. Is London as well, correct?
Hello. Yes. Hello, everyone. I'm also based in London, so not far from where Scott lives. Very pleased to be here with you today.
And last and not least, Sharif, I love the T-shirt. Sharif El Barberi, the Egyptian, employee number 1.5 on L-ISA. I think Guillaume, Sharif, and Christian, you guys started this project many years ago.
Yeah, hi. I'm very, very pleased to join you today, and I'm very fortunate to have been, as you said, amongst number 0.5 to embark on this amazing journey a few decades ago. I'm based actually in Germany. I'm right now in beautiful Aachen, sunny Germany, and joining you here for this get-together.
Excellent. Well, thanks, everyone.
So I have one question, guys.
Yeah.
My first question is, how come everybody has headphones on except for me?
I don't. Oh, I've got headphones on. You're right.
Yeah, I'm looking a little. I'm gonna have a complex here. Just
maybe you have a good speaker system.
We've been doing sound for too long. We're hard of hearing. You know.
I'm worried about this. But Scott says one ear on.
Yeah, he's got a good ear.
Yeah, it's
anyway,
a problem.
Sorry, I just have to recognize that maybe I should put some headphones on or something.
So excellent. Hold on one second. I'm just going to check with Carlos here, make sure we're all set. So everyone who's joining us live on Teams, hold on, send live.
I will speak while you do some stuff, Scott. No worries.
Excellent.
So we are very pleased to have Fred and Scott with us today because they've been working on some of the biggest L-ISA projects to date. And they have together combined a wealth of experience, and we thought it would be a great occasion to tell some stories about the system design they've done, the large-scale project they've been involved with, and compare a bit the experiences and see whether there is can maybe define some trends with regard to the disruptive technology that happens today in live sound with object-based audio, and such as L-ISA, for example. So maybe, Scott, you have a list of questions that you wanted to
I will
start
have
with.
to. Sorry. I will have to interrupt you very, very, very briefly during this phase because I really need to say that the very first L-ISA show that ever happened was actually in Fred Vogler's, I would say house. It's not exactly his house. He spends a lot of time there. And I would like just to share a very quick picture of you guys. I don't know if you see this picture already on the screen.
Oh, look at that. There you go.
We do.
Let me know if you do, because this was actually Fred's birthday, where we had an L-ISA system set up the very, very first time in a live show. And as you can see, Fred is wearing a funny jumpsuit for the show, as I am in the bottom right corner there. Takashi, I think, is the one that we see on that picture. Bottom left, that's Fred during the rehearsal, and on the top right, there is a little bit view of the setup of the system there. So yeah, this is actually 6 years ago, the first show ever happening on L-ISA, and I'm gonna stop sharing my.
Well, I am totally honored to have been the first. I can't quite believe that. It's one of those epic moments in your life where you kind of realized, you're with friends, you're with all sorts of different family, and it was a crazy evening, but I really enjoyed the technology in particular.
You know what's fun about
completely
that night? There's a bunch of people there, obviously, that are into what we do, and I don't think we had told the world about L-ISA yet at all. I don't even know if we had a website at that point, and I walked in and saw 72 Cara in a room that was maybe 30 meter by 20 meter, and just didn't know what to expect or what to experience, and it was a pretty cool night. Now, Scott, you and Fred both.
Well, I can't actually believe that. Yeah, I can't believe you guys actually supported that. You know, when I first saw L-ISA, it was with Sharif and Christian, and it was in the super secret room downstairs at the L-Acoustics headquarters. And I was told, you're going to go down here, you have to sign this NDA or not talk to anybody about this room. There's a lot of employees who've never even been in this room, and I came downstairs not knowing what to expect, and I saw all these speakers. I thought, oh gosh, these guys have gone out of control. They are definitely eating too much cheese, drank too much wine. I don't know what's going on.
You mean the mushrooms that I'm wearing right now?
Yeah, definitely psychedelics. I mean, I don't know what they're thinking, and I remember putting tracks up and thinking, I don't know. I had to play with this, and after a few hours, I started to kind of get that thing in my blood, like, whoa, this isn't 5.1 or some gimmick immersive experience. This is something these guys have thought about this. And Sharif I had met and interacted with over the years from concert tours and stuff that he would come through at the Hollywood Bowl or other places. I hadn't met Guillaume, he wasn't there at the time. And but it was one of these like, and the more I started to play with the system, the more I got it. And wow, it was definitely one of those changing experiences in the way you think about sound.
So Scott, I think you and Fred both were lucky enough to hear L-ISA for the first time in that dungeon 6 years ago. Does that sound right, Guillaume, Sharif? Maybe something like that.
Actually, it was longer than that. I think it was definitely more than 7 years ago that we have introduced. I have to say, Frederick wasn't the first one, but he definitely was amongst the first people to have experienced that and have had the pleasure of playing with.
And Scott, do you remember your first experience?
Also.
Yeah, it was similar. It involved a piece of paper and then Christian waving his arms around a lot and then opening a door to a room full of Cara, which my initial thought was, oh, this looks like a really good way to sell more speakers. But then after, similar to Fred's experience, after listening to it for a little while, it became pretty clear the power of it. At the same time as that occurred, we were already working on a project which was a 180-degree listening environment where we'd done a lot of our own research into the sort of the maximum horizontal spacing that one can use between sources before the space between those loudspeakers is no longer accessible from an auditory point of view, and it was very interesting to compare some of the information, and we'd all ended up at around about the same spot with this sort of 7.5 degree index, and it was really interesting to see that on the other side of a loudspeaker manufacturer, there's this thought around, yes, loudspeakers great. We've done a lot in that regard, and that's good. Everyone seems to be making pretty good loudspeakers these days, so that's great. What's next? And I remember asking Christian that question over a lunch. Sort of, you've managed to kind of reinvent how we do loudspeaker systems. What's next for L-Acoustics? And he very much put a sort of return serve by saying he thinks it's very much in the hands of designers now to actually do a little more. And I guess L-ISA was the next obvious step by providing us with something to make what that. The next obvious step was doing something spatial, and L-Acoustics have given us a really great tool to enable us to do that, which previously didn't exist. We were doing silly things with auxiliaries on consoles and getting ourselves all tangled up in knots, which I'm sure we've all done.
I think that's kind of how I felt about it too, is that volley from Christian about, hey, I'm going to create this platform and this palette, and we have come to know and appreciate L-Acoustics fidelity and the coverage and all this stuff, but now there's this ability to move stuff seamlessly from one element to the next. And I was sort of amazed that, you know, there was no, it didn't jump, it was so effortless and so easy to do, and so natural. And that's, I guess, what kind of caught my ear. You know, that, yeah, he did let us as sound designers, as mixers, as creators, do something grander. And so often, you know, people view this as technology. Oh, you're a technician. You're the board technician. This is an ability to do something more than what a technician would do. This is something that, as creative a designer or mixer or person you are, this will allow you to go that extra, you know, distance. And I haven't tapped out yet. I mean, I still seems like there's more development, more change, more things happening, and I want to do more. That's all I can say.
So for I guess everyone, for Guillaume, for Scott, for Fred, for Sharif, I mean, all of us today at some capacity do sound design, you know, whether that's at our house writing music, whether that's building soundscapes for amazing experiences around the world, Scott, or for Fred, you know, every 6 nights a week, usually at the Hollywood Bowl, and of course cinema scores. Like, what are the critical elements? Where do you start in a sound design? Like, what are the foundation rocks? And I guess my question specifically is, has that changed with L-ISA versus in the past? Have you found a difference?
Who should kick this one off?
Scott, you started.
Yeah,
so
go for it, Scott.
Go, Scott.
I'd love to. So I think I didn't set that up at all, did I?
Andrew?
I guess there's two ways to think about this, in that there are these technologies out there and it's exciting to use them. But to implement technology on a show is the wrong way around. So for me, it's more, everything's driven by the creative intent of a show. And if the creative intent lends itself to a spatial environment, then it makes sense to start considering things like L-ISA and that sort of thing. But the critical elements for me are, localization is really important. The kinds of shows that I tend to be doing are very strong on storytelling. So a really important part of storytelling is being able to have the audience know where a particular element of that story is without the use of their eyes. With so much projection going on, our eyes are already overwhelmed. To localize with sound is how we naturally do that as human beings. That's how we spot when we're under threat, is by our ears less than our eyes. And I guess I use that a lot to drive what I do in my sound designs to support the storytelling and exaggerate the reality of that story, so that it's a little bit more, well, it's exaggerated, it's a bit more enveloping than the reality. And then delivering that in a way that's consistent, so that wherever the audience member happens to be seated, they're still getting a really good experience that's consistent to any other seat they might sit in. I then find lots of things on the shows I'm doing change very, very quickly. So the designs are based around overdoing it. So allowing enough within the system for flexibility, so that when something does change, we've already got a loudspeaker source sitting there ready to replicate the sound of whatever that is that's switched locations. Redundancy is also a big thing. A lot of the shows that I tend to do are kind of, we rehearse for a very long period, and then the show happens in an hour or two, and then that's it. So, you know, 2 years of development, 2 hours of show finished. So redundancy is a really big thing for me as well. I'm very much in the sort of playback shows more so than the live. We do see live from time to time, but often that's taken away because of the risks. I guess, Fred, you'd see kind of the opposite of that in that you don't have the pleasure of having a backup orchestra sitting on the other side of stage.
No, in fact, I was thinking about the what you were saying, the design or the creative intent. Most of the shows I do aren't rehearsed for a week or so. I mean, it's a day of or a couple of days of rehearsal, and then we do a show. And I find that the creative intent is a moving target, and a lot of creators or producer types and stuff don't even know all that exists. And so for me, I like to push it further than they may have imagined and see how it falls, especially given that we're not finessing it a lot. I mean, I want to be able to get as much out of it as possible. And typically, I'm lucky sometimes if I get a single rehearsal and then we do a show. Sometimes they don't even give me a full rehearsal. It's like they have a 3-hour rehearsal blocked out and they give me an hour and a half or something, and we're on air. And I like the idea of exaggerating it. I like the idea of pushing it bigger or grander than anybody would have expected. I think audiences, from what I can tell, audiences are expecting that more and more all the time anyway. The philosophy is, how far can you go? The theme park kind of idea, just push it. So, but yeah, we don't rehearse a lot.
In terms of system design, I had a question to ask you guys, because that was one of the biggest concerns we had when we started to develop this kind of technology at L-Acoustics. There was this notion of maximum SPL that the sound system is capable of handling. And there was always the big question, can we replace a big left-right with another distribution of the energy? And after a few years of use, I don't know if it's true or not, but it seems to me that sometimes L-ISA shows are played with a bit less SPL than stereo shows. Would you agree with me, or is it something that at the end we were right to expect and support the same kind of maximum SPLs?
I guess my experience of that would be it's a little. I'm not sort of from that rock and roll world where sort of power was very much one of the one of the parameters to make your show interesting to your audience. I'm not really from that. That's not really something we've had to contend with. Although something like the London Olympics was a very loud show, not a lot of spatial. It was a distributed stereo, but not really much beyond that in terms of a spatial placement. I think it would be fair to say that there's much more interesting things to do with a mix now, where power is less exciting as a trick than using 3 dimensions. So I would say, yeah, shows are getting less loud. We're also getting much smarter with how we're placing sub-bass. Rather than as many as you can possibly fit in the room, it's now a little bit more scientific, which is quite nice. And that, I guess, for that sort of consistency, as much as possible, creating one source out of the low end and a much tidier impulse response throughout the room in the subs. All of that just adds to a much more consistent experience. And yeah, I guess ultimately the difference between the loudest and the quietest is less. Maybe that means overall, on average, we've come back in level because that +6 that exists in certain locations has gone away.
I think, sorry, just to make a quick note on that, I think there is also nowhere to go. Already levels have been quite loud in events, and they've grown louder and louder because that's how we impress. And now with all the noise pollution police, with all the health and safety, which I think is a great thing, really, to pay attention to how we're sometimes actually project people to harm. I think the possibility to have this excitement, not necessarily by pushing up the fader when you want to impress, I think this added at least a very sensible way of still being able to have the people completely overwhelmed without necessarily going out with their ears bleeding after 1.5 hour show. Sorry, Fred, I just wanted to add that into the equation.
Yeah, you're saying the same thing, Sharif. I was going to say that, I think one of the advantages or people's enjoyment with the low frequency is because of how enveloping that sensation is. And if we can create a full mix that's enveloping, it doesn't need to be thunderous and sound level. I think that that sensation that I watched and paid attention to at the Bowl and watching these shows, and there was a trend to get louder and louder and louder, but then noise ordinance and whatnot have pulled levels down a little bit, kept things more under control. I think if we can spread out the mix and create a immersive environment, it'll be the ultimate. It'll be the thing that pleases everybody and provides them something that they can't get at home on headphones. They are there in the event, and hopefully we'll have other people around at some point again, and they'll all be able to have this sensation of enveloping sound.
I mean, don't get me wrong, I'm not saying that we should, let's say, reduce the volumes by much, because there are key moments in a show which really depend on some physical, I would like to call it like a physical experience of sound, especially in the very low end. And we do take a lot of, let's say, care about providing, let's say, the appropriate SPL and the appropriate bandwidth overall to be able to still tackle these feelings.
It's a good point, Sharif. I think the point is with any of these elements, I did a show a few years ago where we were in a 36.1 environment, and what made the use of that 36 channel environment was how little we used it. So in the same way that, yes, we can deliver an enormous amount of power into the room, and that becomes exciting when you use it less, rather than the entire show from the moment the lights come up to the moment the audience leaves being at, orange lights on every amplifier. To be able to use the dynamics of music a little bit more interestingly, and then add this additional spatial dynamic as well, it's becoming a much more interesting place for an audience member.
Yeah, I've always thought too, like if it's just a volume war, honestly, that's kind of an easy fight, right? Like if you want more sub, just add more sub. There's got to be somewhere else to go than just more in terms of amplitude, right? There's got to be more space, more this, more that. But if we just made the left-right 6 dB louder, and it's still coming from left-right, it's still all the same problems. It just happens to be louder than it was yesterday or last year, the year before. I mean, the whole volume idea, I know we were talking about that. For sure, all the events I've been to with L-ISA, I've felt, I'm like, wow, this show feels so big, so loud. And I look over and the SPL meter at front of house is like 98, and that would have been 104 in the past or 103 in the past, right? Which is just a remarkable feeling to feel huge. But
it would have been 97 4 meters to your right.
That's exactly right. That's exactly right. That's exactly it. So like, for Fred and Scott, probably more so than myself and Sharif and Guillaume, because we don't often directly talk to the people who are putting on these events. Is there a challenge bringing this new technology of any kind, whether that's L-ISA, it's a different sound design than in the past? What have you found the roadblocks along that path?
Well, I think Scott would know just as anybody, it's financial. Everybody sits there and thinks, oh, this is going to cost how much more, and what is this going to mean for, not just the rentals, but the labor and the time and things that we just don't have. And then there's the aesthetics. So it's a big dance, and I think once you expose people to it and have them really experience the difference, then they jump on board. And I think if you can get the artists or the creators to support you, you're much further down the road, because trying to get management to see the light or understand the the advantages is a challenge. I don't give up easily, and sometimes it takes, a season or a cycle or whatever, but it's part of the dance that I'm accustomed to and I'm willing to take on, and know the difference is worth it. So I can imagine the same as for you, Scott.
I guess the difference for me is that a lot of the shows I'm working on are being created for that specific event. And so from the creation of that show, you end up with, this is the intent of this show. And then rather than me saying, I've got this cool spatial audio thing I want to use on this event, that's the invisible part that no one needs to know about. It doesn't even matter. The important bit is I'm supporting the creative intent. And for me to do that, I need a set of tools.
I think we are back online.
Back
Sorry about that, everyone. Yeah, apparently we just had a little challenge. We're back.
Great.
This screen's still up, Scott?
It is, yeah.
Yeah, cool. Okay, so I'm not sure when people dropped off, but this is the show we did a couple of years ago, a 36.
Maybe you want to show the first frontal view as well?
Idea. Yeah, so just so that everyone's up to date. This is the view from front of house, audience area, big stage. There are loudspeakers behind that proscenium, and then these overheads on these wire ropes. These wire ropes are 100 meters long. This is all very, very expensive to deploy. But it's one of those situations where rather than I'm saying I want to use this particular tool because I think it's great, this is simply what I have to be able to do to support your creative. So rather than me trying to push up, I'm simply saying these are the requirements that I need to be able to support the creative adequately. And then if the creative changes, your design changes as well. If the creative changes away from a spatial environment, so should your design. Not that I can imagine any creative that wouldn't involve something spatial. This is a shot during the build that just shows all of the arrays before the skin was put on the proscenium. It's a low quality photo. It's just from my phone, but I realised as I was leaving site that day, they were putting the skin on overnight, so I wanted to make sure I got a shot of that before it vanished.
Well, definitely budget wasn't too much of a limiting issue.
No,
for
you're right.
This show. But
and
the
we had
experience,
programming time, and we had all of the benefits that come with a good budget. All of these sources, it takes a long time to produce content that works well with this stuff. But again, the less we used the surround sources around the back there, and we only had 2 cues that actually did a trajectory of 360 degrees, and they were maybe 6 or 7 seconds each in an hour-long show, and that's what made those moments really special, was the fact that they were brief and there weren't very many of them. Also, just behind the screen, there's a pile of 18 SB-28s, just a block behind the center screen there, and we had one rocket launch, which was part of a brief part of the show. And again, that was the loudest part of the show, and it was loudest by a considerable margin, but it was also 20 seconds long. So again, it was supporting that creative intent.
A very interesting, sorry, just relating to this show, because you just mentioned that you had, let's say, tons of pre-production time, and then the show is just 2 hours. So how does the transition, let's say, from all the pre-production, because of the object-based approach, how did that map out? Did you, let's say, hear what you were expecting, or did you have to do a lot of editing, or did it work out like still in the constraints of time which we always run to? Was that something that could have happened better with a different approach?
We took a very different approach, knowing what our delivery system was, so knowing that we were using a loudspeaker layout that was defined before the music was written. It meant we could capture all of the music in the recording studio in a way that suited the playback environment, rather than capturing for an album and then trying to unwrap those different inputs to suit a spatial environment. This was never being used as a 2-channel stereo track. It was only ever being played back in this environment for one night. So we approached the recording in a very, very different way. And I don't want to spend too much time on it because it's quite off topic, but basically we designed a way of capturing in Air Studios in the Lyndhurst Hall in the main room there. So we had lots of space, 80-piece orchestra. We imagined the orchestra laid out and exaggerated in its dimensions, and then placed the microphones such that all we ended up with on site was 7 large diaphragm cardioid microphones at a distance from the orchestra in the room. We had 7 mono mixes of the close or the bug mics on the instruments for clarity, and then we had a 7.0 reverb output. So basically, we took the large cardioid, the mix of the bug mics and the reverb, and then those 3 channels just went into arrays number 1 through 7, and then we just balanced how much reverb, how much of the sort of squeaky but intelligibility of the bug mics, and then how much of the large diaphragm. So oddly, the music mix for this was the fastest show I've ever done, because we threw the mics up, came up with a clever balance, it worked really well, and then we moved on. With so much video content, you can imagine the number of sound design objects that we were dealing with. That became the really time-consuming exercise. The music mix was minutes.
That's a great transition, actually, to ask Fred how this object-based mixing approach affects your miking techniques in terms of big orchestras. How do you actually prepare for that? And I mean, obviously, I have experienced one of the most amazing mixes very recently of yours, where there were absolutely, I don't know, 60, 70, 80, 90 channels. I don't really remember exactly how many, but a lot of channels with absolutely zero EQ. So how do you achieve such a thing with such a big system with a lot of speakers? And from what I remember, it was quite a very full sounding big arena show with zero EQ on microphones. That's unheard of.
Well, I think, first off, design is a big deal. And I refer to the L-Acoustics design team regularly. We have intent, and there's an idea that, I know the goal of the artist and the presentation. And then the team at L-Acoustics helps to put together something I know that's going to have more of the components that are going to realize this. Going into these type of things, unlike what Scott was showing there, it's all live, and there isn't any playback element. In fact, in the show that you were talking about, it was in Korea last year, and it was with the LA Philharmonic. It was music of John Williams, and there were no synthetic parts. Everything was acoustic. Most of John's music is that way. The Williams scores are known for that. And having done hundreds of orchestral shows and knowing mics and stuff like that, and being very conscious about the polar pattern, the placement of those mics is paramount. And knowing the ensemble and the repertoire is another big challenge. And then having a team of people, that are all competent in his or her roles, like was putting the system up, and we went into that arena. I could show a picture or two, or unless Scott, maybe you had a couple pictures. I think
you got the better ones, Fred. But I don't have them on me, unfortunately. I didn't grab those today.
That's okay. I could put something up and then share a screen. But the idea was how do we fill this space and in a quick manner, because I don't get much rehearsal time.
If I recall that event, while you're sharing your screen, Fred, if I recall that event, so we had a production day to load in and set everything up, and then day of show, the orchestra shows up, and what do they schedule? A 2 or 3 hour rehearsal for everybody, And was it 5 minutes in or 10 minutes in or less, Gustavo, the musical director of the LA Philharmonic, came running up to front of house to hear your mix. So you had the orchestra live for less than 10 minutes before he had to come out and critique what you were doing. So maybe the no EQ was a function of the fact that you had Gustavo there.
No time. Yeah. Don't mess with it. It seems to be working.
Just managed to get the faders up.
Yeah, I think one of the things for miking, in answer to Sharif's thing, is it's interesting, Scott, that you mentioned 7 or a number 7. I think odd numbers seem to work well with this type of approach. Immersive or L-ISA systems. I was thinking in terms of 3s, not 7, just from mic count and what we had to go with. So the soloist was on a 3 mic configuration. A lot of the sections, typically I have some overhead mics, and then I have some area mics, and then some individual mics. And the area mics are typical for like the brass section or the wind section, the front row, back row, maybe the high strings, low strings. And I like to think in terms of an odd number, because when you send it out to these arrays, it seems that a stereo or a pair of them has more interaction. I hear it kind of funny if I try to spread it or move it around, whereas I find that either a mono or three inputs gives me more localization and centers the sound better. And then with the you have that screen, and on our show in Korea I had Carlos and Mosquera, who's genius with the system and the software, and we can take elements and kind of push them back into the blend. So if I have groups of 3s and I bring those elements together and we kind of play around with who's forward, who's in the who's recessed a little bit, that is part of the key thing. I think the other thing that you have to have is some playback or some sort of material to reference. And in the setup days, I didn't have live musicians, but I did have tracks of stuff, multi-tracks of stuff that I could reference in the arena and play. And we spent quite a bit of time doing stuff like that. So you can see the screen. Is that
we got that up.
Correct?
Yep.
Yeah. So this is there's 11 of these arrays. A couple of them are firing out to the sides, and then we have a big sub up the middle, and almost nothing on stage. Little front fills and some crown subs, and the amount of sound and the rich, full bass with authority, and this EQ. Usually I go to high pass. That's probably my favorite EQ. The high pass. And it was weird because I had no ring, or I didn't seem to have any problems with low frequency, and that's so unusual when you're amplifying large orchestral music. And it was almost one of those things that, well, let's gas it some more. I mean, what can we get out of this? I mean, it was kind of a freaky thing. Mm-hmm. And the thing that made Gustavo jump off his podium was the very first thing that they, after we kind of settled in and everything was gone, they said, okay, we went through the sections, and I have Jeff Wallace, who works with me in the Philharmonic. We go through the sections, kind of get a rough balance of stuff, of the players. Then the very first thing they did was the E.T. Movie score, just the opening E.T., and it kind of builds. It goes boom, and that boom was so big, and it hit with such authority, and it didn't feedback or ring or anything. So weird. But Gustavo started laughing. He stopped the rehearsal, put his baton down, and just said, "Fred, I don't know what you did. We want this at the Hollywood Bowl." So it was immediate that we did something right. And Carlos and I were sitting there going, okay. And next thing I know, he's handing the baton to the assistant conductor, and he's going to come out to front of house with us, and he wants to hear this. And Gustavo appreciates high performance, whether it's cars or sound systems. Or, he really got into it, and it was gratifying to see his reaction and his feeling of satisfaction with the sound. So it was one of those things that I wish we could do and have with us at all times. I'm gonna how do you get out of sharing your screen? I forgot that.
I took it off here, so it's fine. That's a great question.
I think just to add a comment. Sorry.
Go ahead, Guillaume.
I think the example, there is a big difference between the two examples you just shown, guys, and that's very interesting to me because one is a full surround with height configuration, and the other one is just only a frontal system. And what I really enjoy is that we call that immersive hyperreal or hyperreal only. And even with a frontal system, you can get such an improvement compared to what you could amplify especially for a classical orchestra. I think that it's really important that we can say that even if budget is an issue, considering just changing the frontal system is already a big step forward.
Mm.
Well, and we were indoor, and Scott's project was outdoor. I love the overheads. I mean, that would be something that would be great to have at the Hollywood Bowl. You know, the ability to move things on, from above. I really thought about that for a long time. The room acoustics is a definite factor, and when you excite it with that many arrays, you hear the difference. I mean, it is overwhelming, and it was fun. I mean, I'd want to do more.
So both,
we did a
go ahead, sorry.
We did a quick. This is quite a quick one. This is an outdoor event, which was Morricone's last live performance last year in Italy in summer. And again, there's no overheads in this, and there's fewer horizontal arrays than you had in your example there, Fred. This was loaded in the morning, and the show was that evening. So again, it's that kind of very fast turnover.
Right.
But in this example, this is not the first show that had been done with L-ISA. It was the first show of this scale. And the thing that was surprising, to Guillaume's point about level we were talking about earlier, it was 120 meters from the stage to the back row before we got to the delay towers, and then it was another 120 meters beyond the delay towers. The delay towers were still being installed as we were sound checking the orchestra, and what was really surprising was how far beyond the intended coverage it was still a very impactful, clear, exciting mix to listen to 150 meters from the stage. And it's not like we're looking at 300 K1 here. That center array there is 15 Cara. So it's not a big PA. I am, yeah.
I think it actually also is very impressive because it sounds real, like no matter how you align a delay and no matter how absolutely superb it is actually blending with the PA from the stage, you never get the reality of something that is at such a big distance. So it sounds real, and it might be, let's say, a few dBs less than you can achieve with the delay tower system, but the experience certainly is, oh yeah, the orchestra is really far away, but I can hear them nicely. And this is, I think, amongst the experiences we've made also even in large arenas where there was only a frontal system with no delay. And we were quite, I mean, I wouldn't say Christian was absolutely convinced that it will work better. Me, after like 35 years of touring and using ring delays and whatnot, I was, let's say, a little bit suspicious. And I went in the furthest seat, was in the O2 in London, which is quite a hungry arena for energy. I went into the furthest seats everywhere, all the way up the top. And it was really, really impressive to experience that. Yes, the PA is far away, but I hear a full sound, it's pleasing, even if it's a few dBs less. But the reality of the distance of the band on the stage added to this experience in never before experienced way.
Yeah, completely.
So,
I completely agree with you guys on that. Like, having, I mean, Fred, that show you did last year in Korea, that arena was 80 meters deep. 90 meters deep. Typically, for an orchestral show in an arena, you would have been putting up delays. You would have been doing any number of things. And Scott, I mean, 120 meters for the tower position, so the delays weren't really even starting till 130 or 135,
140.
Yeah, I mean, that's unheard of in my mind, right? Yeah, I mean, we've all gotten accustomed now to the sound level must be perfectly equal everywhere. In reality, is the only time that's true is when you put up a sound system, right? If you go to the orchestra hall, it's 3 dB less loud in the back than it is if you're sitting in the middle, and it's a whole lot louder if you're sitting in row 4. I mean, the orchestra feels a lot different, and that's the truth and the reality, and your brain accepts that and wants that. And so when you hear this L-ISA system in a large space, if you're up close, it's a bit louder, but you're also, you can see the detail, you can see the hand movements, and that makes sense. And when you go to the back, all the clarity is there, all the separation is there. The panorama is a bit narrower because that's geometry, but it feels perfectly right, and it's quite an interesting experience. I'll share with you, and I know I've told this story before. A few years ago, this is 3 years ago maybe, did the first show with Bon Iver with L-ISA just up the road in Santa Barbara, and about, I don't know, 15 minutes into the show, everything's settled, calmed down. I decide to leave front of house and take pictures. And I get my phone out to take some pictures because that's what I should do and send to Christian and Sharif and Guillaume. And I pull my phone up and I look around and I realize my screen is glowing and nobody else has their phone out. And I'm at a hipster concert with a bunch of 35-year-olds who do nothing but live stream where they're at so that everyone knows that they're cool. And nobody is taking any pictures. And I kind of take 3 pictures and put my phone away in my pocket and, walk around a little bit more and take 2 and put it away. And after the show, a reporter comes up to me who was at the show and she goes, "You know what I noticed? Nobody was taking pictures." And I was like, "I did too." So about 20 minutes after the show, I'm backstage and I'm talking to the band and I asked them how it was, what was your feelings? And the lead singer, the artist himself says, "You know what I noticed? Nobody had their effing phones out." Like he noticed that the audience was engaged and just captivated by what they were experiencing, not documenting this for their friends at home. And I think that experience is pretty interesting. I don't know if you guys have seen that at events you've been to as well, Scott or Fred or Guillaume or Sharif.
I have, but I think that's awesome. I mean, I know that in Korea that it's a very polite crowd, but they were knocked out. And as the concert went on, the crowd got more engaged and wilder, at the stops, and there was a lot of encores and stuff like that. But I mean, I think that's very exciting to hear that people are so engaged in the experience that they're not wanting to turn to their phones or whatever to distract and carry on. So I don't know. Have you seen that, Scott? That's interesting.
No.
Basically, you don't go to shows in general, so you wouldn't have.
Sadly, I mean, that photo that I was showing you before of the stage with Morricone, I can see there's about 6 people holding their phones up, but that's before the show had actually begun. No, I don't really have a lot of experience of that. Most of the shows we're doing happen once only ever, so there's perhaps a little bit of more compelling reason to maybe desire to capture it. I don't know.
I think speaking of Morricone, this brings up really a very nice memory because as Fred mentioned at the beginning, it's really hard to convince someone that you need to have this system or that a multi-channel system, object-based and all that is really the way forward. And I think this was the only time that I know of that someone actually have been able to compare a left-right system to an L-ISA system. And maybe, Scott, you probably could better tell the story because it's, I mean, the people going into the effort in setting up the full left-right system in a big arena in Milan and setting the full L-ISA system to really compare, is this really worthwhile doing that? And from what I heard, it didn't take more than seconds.
It took the maestro seconds to make the decision, and I think it's only it's worth mentioning that it could have been an ongoing conversation, like Fred was mentioning at the top of this chat, where if you don't get it the first year, you slowly bit by bit you convince the producers that it's worth having. But there was a lot of Italian pride involved in this. Morricone's a legend in Italy. Agora, who were the supplier for Morricone on these shows in Italy, they and L-Acoustics took the costs on themselves to make this point. They wanted to prove to the entire production that this was worth it from a loading point of view. It'll cost us maybe 20% more rigging. It might cost us 15% more time. And they got it down to the point where they were loading in at the same time of day with an L-ISA tour as they were the previous year with the stereo tour. So just by being a bit more sophisticated with the way they package the systems. But yes, it was quite an amazing situation to have where two complete systems were set up, were both in the air at the same time, and just flicking a switch, you could listen to the two mixes. And yeah, that was down to the commitment from L-Acoustics and Agora to show the maestro that this is the way to go, and they believed in it so much that they paid for it. And yeah, the maestro walked down from the stage, didn't quite get to front of house before he'd made his decision, and then informed Fabio, the mix engineer, and Fabio had a really enjoyable rest of the day mixing on L-ISA, preparing for the show the next night.
And many more shows after that.
Yeah, exactly. And the stereo system was packed into a different truck and was sent back to Rome.
So this is really like the hearing is believing, like what I always say about L-ISA. You really got to hear it, experience it. There's so much you can explain. There's much you can tell about it. But once you heard it, and especially if you heard a comparison, I think it's clear that that's what we've been waiting for.
Yeah, and I think that, as we've had in other conversations, it's not subjective. I mean, it's an obvious increase in quality and experience, and well worth the time or the extra money, because people will appreciate that. I think that it's a more and more sophisticated audience all the time. And you have more things to compete with, whether it's their social media apps and all that stuff, or their home systems or their car systems. You got to give them something that's exceptional in the live setting or in the show setting. And L-ISA is the next. It's like the next level of excitement from a sound standpoint. And what a great thing to be able to compare and contrast between the two.
So question for
Scott, I think you had a few questions from the audience, right?
Yeah, I do actually, and that's exactly where I was going. This one was actually a few minutes ago, but we were on such a roll I didn't want to stop anybody. So Scott, your event you were talking about earlier, you obviously mentioned that the orchestra was pre-mixed ahead of time. For the actual show itself, you said you had a lot of video tracks, you had a lot of different things. Did you ultimately print the show, or did you run it live?
So we didn't have the intention to print the show, but the computers convinced us that 400 channels at a cross point is probably a bit too much. So after one of the final dresses where 400 channels during a crossfade, the computer started to have some problems. We thought maybe we should print this. So at the end of that rehearsal, we printed it out, and it went from 400 channels at a crossfade down to 120. A lot more survivable for the computers. So yeah, we didn't intend to print it, but the track count required us to.
Yeah, that makes perfect sense. I mean, Sharif and I and Carlos, who's helping out in the moderation on this conversation today, and a few others at L-Acoustics, we've done a few projects in art domes, and they'll come in with 150 or 200 voices on the session. At the end of the day, the thing's going to run 40 times a day, every 15 minutes. There's no reason to stress the computer out. And
yeah, no, exactly.
Just
print it.
Yeah, absolutely, absolutely. And that's not a weakness necessarily of L-ISA. It's just if anyone's ever used a DAW with 300 voises, the likelihood of it running every time.
Yeah, there's in my mind, you would have to have a very good reason not to print it.
And that's
so the question is not whether it's going to crash. The question is when it's going to crash.
Totally.
Absolutely, I think there is no way you can go safe, especially for these counts of channels and these frequency of shows running day in, day out, 15 minutes with 5 minutes to 10 minutes changeover. I think, yeah, if you can go the safe route.
Fred,
on the contrary, there are some, just to comment on that, sometimes there are shows where the sound and the positioning is directly controlled from the performers themselves. So I'm thinking of a dance tour that was happening in the US and now in Russia, where that would be impossible. So I guess it really depends on the real-time control of the objects.
Yeah,
sure.
Exactly. Yeah, but perhaps the music that's sitting behind it is not dynamic, so you can print that and just have fewer of the objects dynamic.
And then Fred, obviously doing live performances in indoor spaces. I mean, you've done a few of those between Dead Mouse, between the LA Philharmonic and others. Do you find there's a difference in the way you tune a system, you voice a system compared to Left, Right, or L-ISA? Do you approach it differently when you start out with the orchestra? Is anything that's different about that, or is it a similar workflow, just times more arrays, times more options to mix?
It's a similar workflow and setup. I mean, other than we have to account for the more arrays, and as I said, some sort of a reference material to kind of better understand the coverage. I think that the more arrays excites the room, dramatically more, and I think in a positive way, but nonetheless, you still have to account for that or consider that when you're going to put the mix together. So the room acoustics are an issue, the miking techniques, and kind of what you're capturing. And I find that left, right, I can lean on the overheads, the overhead mics or the main mics more than I can with a L-ISA or the multi-distributive systems, because for some reason I want more of the individuals to be able to feed into the object-based mixing and less of the overhead capture. And in a stereo, it's more of the overheads with filling them up a little bit with the spot mics.
I think you also usually for a left-right mix you more use a Decca tree with some extra mics as your, let's say, main global picture, and then fill it in. And with L-ISA, I think you found out that it's not as helpful to have such setup, but go to more spot mics rather than close up.
Yeah, absolutely. Yeah, that's a guarantee. And I think it's, that training or having come from the record industry or making stereo recordings for so many years, and you think, well, I need to capture the big sound and I'll enhance it with these spot mics. And it's sort of the opposite with object-based mixing. Now you can take all these individuals and you can group them and put them in a area and move them spatially around that area, but you're not constrained to a stereo image. You have much more to expand with.
And just a very brief question about, especially with orchestral, the ambience with something that we have built in with a room engine in L-ISA. Did you try pushing, let's say, the orchestra into that, or do you rely on external effects that you're more familiar with?
Currently, I'd rely on external effects more. As I had mentioned, you don't get a lot of time with these setups. If I was, within the L-ISA world for a summer or even a month or two, I'm sure I would, find out what the engine inside is doing more and have more to say about that, as far as how it compares to the external devices. But I'm intrigued. When I've done it in the studio with you, Sharif, or we've mixed, I rely heavily on the internal stuff. But in the live setting, I just haven't gone there yet.
No, I'm just asking because, especially like all the classical shows have really, really loved the room engine, because just push things back in distance and use this ambience already gives them this layering in depth and all that when you're using the room engine, which is just supposed to create this ambience of gelling everything together in the same space. So yeah, I'm looking forward to experience this together with you someday when we are allowed to see each other in person again.
So I think another question here is interesting is if you had to choose, and I guess you can choose both, right? But what's more important? Is it the algorithm, like how it works in movement or distance or width, or is it like the interface? In other words, like the cleanliness or the smoothness of operation and how it impacts your creation? Do you guys have a preference one way or the other? Are both equally important? So that's an interesting question, I guess.
Well, for me, I could say it's interface. The algorithm I'm going to leave to you smart guys to come up with that. I just need something that's quick to use and sounds good and that is fluid and you're in a live show, you don't have a lot of time I'm not thinking about the algorithms, quite frankly. I'm thinking about accessibility, and we got to make a change or something's happening and there's unexpected things going on and you just have to be able to react quickly. So for me, it's ease of use and how fast I can jump on it.
For me, the algorithm would be a little bit based on application. So I had an experience with one of the L-ISA jobs where we were using some of the panning needed to be done before we were on site. So we were doing that in Pyramix with the Pyramix panner. And then comparing the minimum width of the Pyramix panner to L-ISA was very interesting in that with the Pyramix panner, we couldn't quite place a source exactly on, place an object exactly on a loudspeaker such that it wasn't spilling into adjacent loudspeakers. Whereas with the L-ISA panner, that wasn't the case. I think the flexibilities or the creative side of depth and width are vastly different between the different algorithms, and that's the more you use them, the more you'll figure out what your preference is. But overarching over the top of all of this is your show is only ever going to be as good as your operators and the operators' familiarity with whatever that platform is. So I'm really lucky that I'm surrounded by really, really talented operators, but also the more tools they have available to them insofar as plugins that they can use in a workstation environment, being able to use OSC triggering as well, and all this other stuff that we can use to help speed up that production process. It's very much both are important, but I would make the decision about algorithm a lot less emotionally than I would about the people I surround myself with and their familiarity with those tools.
And I think it's cool below, on everyone's screen at home, you guys don't see this, but the two guys on the bottom here, Sharif, you have very much been the interface guy. You've been arguing and fighting for years about the ergonomics and making this a tactile, intuitive thing. And Guillaume, I'm going to call you the algorithm guy because you're very much the one who said, oh, this is the algorithm. So the two of you, we can let fight it out. But
we always argue because we always have to say no to each other. You know,
yeah.
So I'm proposing something, he says no, and when he does the same, I say no. So it's been going on forever.
But I think it's a really
the
important
science and the magic.
Yeah, exactly. I think it's a really interesting. Go ahead, Fred.
Yeah, that's a really great dynamic between Sharif and Guillaume. I mean,
and Christian actually as well.
And Christian, yeah. Well, Christian's the ringmaster, right? He brings all of us characters together and makes us interface. You know, where we want to say, hey, no, and that's not how we're going to do it, or that's not practical, or that's whatever. But it's really wonderful to see that you guys have that kind of a dynamic too. I mean, I think there is a live and there is a practical, theoretical solution that you have to consider. So
yeah, I'm always wearing, let's say, not only two, I'm wearing 3 hats sometimes, because like I'm coming from the live sound touring industry for like more than 35 years. I'm mixing engineer. I developed into a systems engineer actually with the invention of the line source array with the VDOS, where I gathered a lot of experience due to my early start, my conviction of the system, my relationship to Christian. So on the one hand, I'm really fighting hard from the point of view of the mixing engineer who needs something that is absolutely easy to use, intuitive, that doesn't add a lot of clutter. And it's hard because we're adding so much intelligence and so much more functionalities to our platform. It's ever growing, and it's a really very fine balancing way of like, how can we still do this, not from a programmer's point of view, but from a user's point of view. And that's where a lot of the fights happen. And like, we're luckily surrounded with an amazing team, and we're also surrounded with amazing users that feed us with a lot of great ideas as well. I mean, like we have 2 examples here sitting with us and chatting, where we're really, really very happy to see how their creativity. I remember you, Fred, saying like, I don't want to be restricted in putting something here or here. I want to put an instrument there and the other instrument over there, and that should work. And so this challenge always is actually also a very good driving force to fight the fight and try to get everyone to use his creativity the way he would like to.
Yeah, I think that we are all lucky to be in a situation to work on such a exciting system and concept, So all the developing team behind the products are really also very passionate about the features or the development they can bring to the platform, and that's really something quite unique, I find. I think we still have a few questions that I see on the chat. Scott, do you want to pick one?
Yeah, so maybe for Scott first, and maybe this doesn't apply because your shows don't have to compromise, but occasionally a show has to.
Well, I wouldn't say so. There is actually no show, no matter what level, there is always compromises that have to be taken. And could it be like for a wrong drawing beforehand, or could it be like, I'm just exaggerating a little bit, but you just arrive at a venue or at a site and something like requires compromise. So I don't know where this is going, but I'm just thinking there's always compromise, no matter.
Is there a priority to compromise when it comes to the system design or the mix? Like, is one thing more important? Is it the number? Is the resolution of? So we're talking about maybe a 7.1 or a 9.1 or an 11.1. Do you compromise that first, or turns out the trim height's going to have to be compromised, or like is there something that's more or less you'll fight for, I guess, or surrounds or elevation, that kind of thing?
Ooh, that's really hard because it changes with the geometry. You know, the loudspeaker system design is about geometry and the creative intent, and often I'll give up on the things that are less important to me in the effort of securing something that's more important to me. But that will be different depending on the gig. So it's quite a tough one to answer, but the design is always the most important thing. And there are, to the point where certain things I'll simply say I can't change that for these reasons. You'll have to find some other way, and I'm happy to change something else. But yeah, it's important in a design to understand where you're able to help out the production, being a good production citizen, but at the same time, you're there to do a job. And if something you're being asked to do will compromise your job, it is your job to say, I can't do that. But what are those things? It's different in every application.
Yeah, I ditto that. I think that, the height of the arrays, they always want them out of the lights or cameras or whatever, and the number of the arrays, and then, the cost of the arrays and everything. Everybody's trying to always compromise your craft or your product. And to Scott's efforts, you can say, hey, no, you can't do this. It's not going to happen. And it's tough. You have to say it with a smile, or you have to be open to maybe altering it a little flexibility. But some things are too grand. If you compromise, it's going to take the whole thing down and lower the level.
I think it's the most important thing in all of this is purpose. And if the purpose is to win the argument, then you've already lost. If the purpose is to protect the integrity of the show, then you will win. But that's how you have to present your argument. This is about protecting your show from your own decisions. And I'm here to make sure this sounds good. I can change these other three things if that helps you. This particular topic is about making sure I protect the integrity of your show. So I think that's an easier argument than saying, than sort of, it's not about winning. It is simply about protecting the integrity of the show.
And so I suppose, Scott, in that show you did with all the overheads, you couldn't compromise on their 7.1 because you'd pre-recorded everything for that format, but you could have compromised.
No. The good thing was, sorry, I'll let you finish your question in a second. We only did the recording once we knew what our loudspeaker system was.
Right. So, but if you got on site and they said, "Oh my gosh, the rigging won't take this," the response would have been, "We have to figure out a way."
Try harder.
I think this is more on a touring level where you're actually, let's say you're touring and you run into different challenges every day, and sometimes you have to take decisions and compromise. I think that's more of a different world than.
Yeah.
Go ahead, Guillaume.
Yeah, I was about to ask the questions from the audience. Shall I take there was an interesting one for the orchestra show with delays. I think we're talking about outfills here, where the outfills, delays, where delays fed from the mono mix down. And how would it compare to a good human mix?
The delays were fed from the LCR off the processor because there were three of them and they were mostly overlapping. And it worked great.
And to add a bit of details on that, there is a way to somehow control the divergence of the LCR using the pan range of the mix downs, to be honest. So there is a bit of flexibility there that you can adjust. And maybe another one, how do you deal with effects as reverbs or delays on an L-ISA system?
So I'm assuming that's external devices like maybe a harmonizer, a doubler, or a delay, or something like that.
Mm-hmm.
Well, I bring them back in. Usually they are stereo returns, and you put them pretty wide in the system. I think that I haven't been too heavy-handed with a lot of that effects, so I can't say, oh, the optimum placement as this. I just go wide and kind of to the back and side, not with too much time or depth on them either. So that's been my experience with them. Delay effects and those types of things are totally different. Then I go really wide, and those can go all over the place. But reverb is kind of more back and side.
There's an interesting point with this stuff. If you're dealing with a frontal system, it's hard to break anything, I suppose, in the time domain. Once we start dealing with either surround or 360, where there's overhead as well, the placement of those effects sources, you need to be very, very careful that you never put the audience in a situation where they can hear an effect return before the direct sound. This is one of the benefits of using the onboard room engine over external stuff, is that it thinks about it for you. But yeah, it's definitely something that can be used very effectively, but cautiously. The one thing, as soon as you're in a 360 environment, is to always think about the time domain and what is this going to sound like. It's easy to know what it's going to sound like in the middle. That's really straightforward. It's thinking about what it will sound like at the fringes of the audience, and keeping that in your head, and always thinking about what am I doing in the time domain here, and what's this going to sound like.
This brings us always to the discussion about how far should be the closest and the furthest person from these surround speakers. The further away they are from the closest person, I think the easier it is to use the time domain, the propagation time that suits most of the audience, as opposed to if they're, let's say, 1 meter above the heads of someone in the back, then you've lost already. So,
and this is where compromise will absolutely be used every single minute of the day. The back 2 rows, too bad.
They should have bought a more expensive seat, right? That's how it works.
Yeah, they should have turned up earlier. Exactly.
Yeah.
There's another interesting question about, did you ever use a binaural monitoring system to pre-produce any show with such multi-channel systems?
I have.
And how does it translate to the physical world? I think here it's also a question of scale, I guess.
I've never done that because it just seems to be the acoustic itself plays such a role in the headphones. As I said earlier, I'm a speaker person, so I haven't taken a binaural miking or a binaural approach to anything. It's much more interactive with the speakers in the room for me. Oh, did I lose you?
No, we're here. Everyone would just someone said tangerine or something. So, Scott, have you used any of the binaural pre-production methodologies at all?
No. Again, this comes down to that binaural approach requires the listener position to be, in a production sense, you need to be able to alter the listener position to understand what you're creating, not just in the middle, but on the fringes as well, like I was saying before. I'd much rather do that with loudspeakers. So
do you do that in the pre-production sense? Do you actually simulate then different environments just so you can check it out?
Yeah, we use sound vision to work out the different latencies, and then throw that into a processor and then just come up with some presets.
Got it. So you have in a show for 3,000 people, you might say, let's simulate the middle, the sweet spot. Let's simulate back, left, front, right, down center where the VIPs are.
I'd kind of just do a diagonal towards one corner, knowing that it flips and mirrors.
Okay, got it.
I think this is the similar approach we've done with Alche, if you remember, Scott, that I've spent, let's say, a few days with the band in the studio before we've done the stadium show with a full surround system, and we simulated exactly as you said, like diagonally front close to the PA on the right-hand side and the very rear back left-hand side. And I just was able to put the band actually in these listening positions so they understand. You can talk for hours about propagation and how levels and the proximity to speakers will affect. As soon as they heard it, they immediately understood.
Yeah, exactly.
Okay, that doesn't work.
It's so much more powerful. Yeah.
Yeah.
Just to finish on the binaural question, there is also a challenge when you work with frontal systems, is that sometimes it's a bit challenging to have a real perception of sound being at the front of you. And that's something that could depend on the binaural technology you use. So it can be a challenge, but there are, I guess, a few systems out there that can answer it well.
So I've got one big question left, but real quickly, Sharif, this was an important one. It was highly liked in the forum or the chat. Where did you get your T-shirt?
Also a historic show, not a show actually. This was the very first festival that we've done with L-ISA before, I think, before it was even launched. And this is in Paris, La Villette, which is the jazz festival. I might go up a little higher. So I don't know whether you see that.
Nice.
So this was, as you can see, 2015.
Wow.
We've done a festival where engineers coming into the festival were using the house infrastructure. Front of house mixer was in there, the stage split system, everything was in there. So they ran into actually a show using something that they've never heard about before. And there we had actually 5 frontal arrays, and these were like, as a matter of fact, high quality jazz bands from all over the world. And some were a little bit, nervous, freaking. I want my left, right, and I was saying like, hey, it's very, very simple. Just use pan. You don't have to use anything more than just, instead of using the pan pot on your console, just use the L-ISA pan. You don't have to go into distance, width, nothing. The only difference is not only you will hear this instrument for where you pan it at the sweet spot at front of house, but everyone in the venue was going to hear it from there. And this was like after maybe 5 minutes, of course, I was there to help them, or my dear friend and colleague Dave Bracey, who helped us out, also an amazing front of house engineer. He was introduced to this technology already, and he was helping engineers to set up quickly their mix. So yeah, this is marks the first festival 5 years ago where L-ISA has been used.
Sharif, maybe they were more worried about the fact that L-ISA was a cardboard box with some XLRs hanging out of it. Perhaps that was their concern.
But when the R&D does the on-field support as well, it's not it's not reassuring.
I'll tell you what,
it was actually a very eye-opening event, and there were a lot of good experiences that we taken from that. And it was, as a matter of fact, on the fly developments have been merged because we had to solve a problem, and then we'd receive a build and use it for the show. It was great.
I actually came to, whichever night it was, 3rd or 4th night, I came down in Paris and saw the show, and I didn't make sound check. So I showed up and 2,000 people were sitting there. So I couldn't really walk around without being that guy that's walking around in a show. But I sat next to front of house and just listened. And I'll tell you what, more than anything, the entire performance, I wanted to go over and just mute the console because it didn't feel like a PA I'd ever heard before in a large venue. It's the first time I'd heard it in more than somebody's birthday party or a small dungeon at L-Acoustics, right?
Excuse me?
And it's just, there's a very different feeling when you're in an R&D space to listen to L-ISA than when you're at a show for that first time. And it's just, I wanted so badly to just go over and tell Dave to mute the console. I just wanted to hear the whole thing change, but it just felt like that 4-piece jazz band was a 4-piece jazz band, and I was in a cabaret with 200 people. not in a train station, renovated train station hall with 2,000 or whatever that space was.
Yeah, this is what I like with the L-ISA system, is that you can forget it's there, or you can really make sure everyone notices it's there. So you have the full spectrum.
I think that's a perfect pivot. I've got one last question. It's kind of maybe it's one everyone might need a thought for, so I can fill the time up. Sharif, as the most historical person on the panel, down to Scott, who's obviously not more than 27.
You mean in age? Thank you,
of course.
Scott. Thanks.
Yeah, Scott, who's by far the youngest. Throughout your career as a sound designer, what are the most transformative technologies that have come your way? Is there certain things that you can remember a day in time throughout your entire career? Anyone wants to go first, have at it. I know I'm kind of throwing out a big question here, but I think it's an interesting one to ask.
Well, I'm happy to start. I think when I was 12 and I saw my first multi-track recording device, a reel-to-reel that a friend's dad had, I was like, holy, what? I need to be part of this. This was too crazy. I was in bands, or I wanted to, do music, but I could never believe that this layering, you could add a track on top of a track and play to it. It was just mind-boggling, and I had to get. He had an 80-8. It was one of those Tascam half-inch 8 tracks, and I had to have one of those so badly. It took me years and convincing my parents and helping, fund and doing jobs, but that was a transformative moment for me, setting me down that path of sound and audio. So I don't know if you want to contribute there, but multi-track, and then obviously digital technologies, the compact disc and what that's done and what that did to the music industry in general, just how digital sound and capture and control and distribution and save and recall and all the digital systems, another world.
I would think for me, real-time convolution was quite a big moment. I can't go quite as far back as you, Fred.
Sorry.
No, I am sorry. We go from reel to real-time convolution. It's quite a leap, but that was a big one creatively, I think, and a lot of really interesting things have come of that. Not just insofar as being able to, or the lake processing that we saw come out of all of that, the room simulation and being able to auralize the sound of a room before it's even built. All those kind of really interesting things all have come out of that one development, which I think is pretty remarkable. An obvious one for me is line source, but that's boring. The other one would be digital consoles that work. So we've all had plenty of horrific experiences of digital consoles that don't, but now we're very, very much, and I guess we have been for maybe it's fair to say 10 years now, maybe 12, been in a situation where they all kind of do work now mostly. And what we're able to do with what you were saying, Fred, being able to store things and recall things in so many different ways. And then the next big obvious step is this move into immersive sound. They're the big moments for me.
Yeah, I agree.
I'm the eldest, so I will go last, but then I will also have two things to talk about, if I may.
Yeah, I mean, I think for me, I think Scott, I think you and I are pretty similar age, so we kind of missed some of that early tape machine world. But the very first time I recorded a band on a DAW, and realized that we could retake a take 15 times and really easily do it. Maybe that was my transformation to realizing how powerful and how important that is. The first real PA I used in touring was VDOS, so I didn't have to unlearn all these habits that were point source arrays. I didn't know them, so for me it was just normal that this is how an array should work. I think
I might be a bit older than you then.
Oh, all right. Or maybe I started.
Moving on. Sorry, keep going.
Maybe I started working a little younger. How about that? Yeah, that for me, I never had to unlearn that. It was only an odd experience when I didn't have it, right? So when I all of a sudden went back to a big giant point source array, and it was kind of a shocking experience, and scratching my head trying to figure out why I couldn't get this to work. It didn't make sense to me. I mean, it did, but it was just a frustrating day all over. It's like, okay, that's tough. But going forward into L-ISA has been in this whole new world of multi-channel immersive mixing environments. It's got to be the step forward. And every time I go to see one of these shows, it's really hard to go to a stereo show now. It was amazing to see that show with Bon Iver the 3 days before they played at the Hollywood Bowl, Fred, and it's a great band, and they have a great mixing engineer. And if you sit at front of house, it's utterly fantastic. And I had a box, the band got me a box. I'm 5 meters right, and my wife and I are there. Laurent Vassier, the CEO of L-Acoustics, and his wife are there. We've got a couple of bottles of rosé, and we're having a great time. And it was really boring. It was like the most boring show to be at. And I love the band, and I love the music, and I love the Hollywood Bowl. And the guy who designs the PA is handsome and tall, and the guy who tunes it is also handsome and tall. So it's quite a nice place. But it was a pretty boring show. And then 4 days later, we're hearing it in L-ISA, and it was just jaw dropping. So for me, that's been something that's been pretty amazing.
Maybe it was the rosé.
Yeah, it could be. And my wife had she was looking nice that night too. So
I will put it on the rosé too. I agree.
Yeah, yuck. Sharif?
I thought Guillaume would go first.
Oh yeah, I can have my geeky moment. Perfect. I would say for me, the one of the turning points of audio technology, maybe I will talk about software a bit more, was the ability to have a modular software, to have blocks, DSP blocks that you can connect together in real time and try stuff and try completely crazy ideas and hear it in a matter of minutes. So I'm talking about stuff like Pure Data or Max MSP, this kind of software that a lot of musicians use, but actually as a research engineer, we use a lot as well. And they are so great that you can iterate very quickly between an idea and another one.
Cool.
Rapid prototyping.
Exactly. Yeah.
Am I being too biased if I mention like really two key moments in life that affected my whole career? If I relate these two moments to L-Acoustics, am I being too biased? Or so the first thing is actually the transition from a mixing engineer to a systems engineer as well, because of a technology that has emerged on the market, was VDOS and the line source array. I was so completely, utterly convinced that this is the best thing that happened to live sound ever, after building big houses of a lot of speakers on both sides of the stage and having a great sound for the first 35 meters because of all the averaging that's happening there, and then moving further back, and all of a sudden, like, there is only between 300 and 600 hertz that you can hear back there. That was the first moment that actually played a major part in technology for me. And the second one is much more actually, how to say, a little bit romantic. I mean, I'm a failed drummer, I confess. Like, I went to the other side of the multicore because I knew I'm not going to make my living playing drums after seeing like some big drummers on the stage. So, but as a young drummer, I've seen the Grateful Dead in Egypt in front of the pyramids with their wall of sound. And this wall of sound was actually a PA. For each musician, he had a PA behind him that only was reproducing his instrument. And it went so far that even, let's say, for the bass guitar, the PA was actually divided in 4 parts for each string of the bass guitar. I don't know. I mean, I was really young back then. I did have big hair. I wouldn't say long. I had big hair. And maybe these were just rumors, but I really read that the bass rig, the PA behind the bass player, were divided in 4 for each string. Cut a long story short, the dream of having experienced this in front of the pyramids as a young person, and then the opportunity to work on trying to recreate something that was sitting so deep, like this amazing experience, the emotional experience of seeing this big band has been really very emotional, and working on this multi-channel approach and trying to bring this natural experience I cannot really describe it in words. So yeah, that was definitely Vidosk and L-ISA were key moments of my life.
Can I share one picture with you,
Yeah, please.
Sharif, since you mentioned this?
Oh my God.
I just want you to see one picture. Can you see this picture?
I see a lot of pictures, but not the one you're probably...
Maybe this one here.
Exactly. This is what I'm talking
crazy?
about.
This is at the Hollywood Bowl in 1971 or something, because they have the speakers up on top that were part of this system design back in the day. But when I saw this picture, I had to capture it because it was just too crazy. And I liked the idea that each performer, I didn't know the design was that each performer had a chunk of speakers to represent his or
just his instruments.
Yeah, that's pretty crazy.
So I think it was probably in 74 or no, 75 probably. It was in Cairo, in front of the pyramids in Giza that I've seen.
That'd have been epic.
3 nights there. I cannot explain how epic that was in words. Sorry for boring everyone with this, but really this has been like an absolute amazing moment in the history of live sound.
Yeah.
Well, guys, thank you very much. I mean, we targeted an hour conversation, and I'm going to imagine we could keep going for another 3 hours. But Scott, it's definitely time for a cocktail in London.
It is.
Yeah. So thank you, Scott, for joining us. Fred, it's always great to see your face. Hopefully soon we'll be at the Hollywood Bowl listening to some good music. Hopefully sooner as opposed to later. Everyone out there who joined us today live, thank you very much for joining us. I hope everyone is safe and healthy and can use this time to learn a little bit more about sound in general and hopefully L-Acoustics and L-ISA. If you guys have questions, don't hesitate to reach out to us on social media. We would love to hear from you. Guillaume, great to see you as well. I can't wait to come back to Highgate soon.
It was a pleasure.
And have lunch at the pub. And Sharif, we'll see you there soon as well, my friend. Thank you guys very much.
Okay.
Thank
you,
you everyone. And
Thanks,
it's been
guys.
great. I hope to see you both soon in person. Thanks a lot.
Cheers.
Bye-bye.
Bye.
Bye now.
Cheers.